Good afternoon, friends. This is CEC Gurukul lecture series, and we have started a new, lecture series under the title "Romantic Trend in English Writing." And today is the second discussion. The first three discussions, including the one that was previously done the day before yesterday, today's, which is the second one, and tomorrow the third one. These three are devoted to the background to romantic writing. Always in life as well as in history, there is a background against which certain trends in literature emerge. So these three lectures are devoted to that, and today's lecture would then be 18th century as background, because 19th century occurs, romantic trend occurs only towards the end of the 18th century. So the whole century seems to be preparing itself for evolving a new perspective on literary expression. So we have this topic today, and for this topic we have the expert Dr. Payal Nagpal, who teaches English literature in Janaki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University, and she has done extensive work on literary theory, modern Indian writing, as well as the 18th century, 19th century literary issues. And she has published articles as well as books on these trends and related aspects. And today we have Dr. Payal Nagpal with her. Welcome. And before we start the discussion with Dr. Payal Nagpal, let me tell you, friends, that towards the end of the lecture, 20 minutes before the lecture ends, let's say at 3:10, we will have time for you also. You can come in and participate through telephone in the discussion. You can raise questions. You can raise issues of your own. You can make observations. You are welcome to do that. And for that we have a toll-free number, which is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, this toll-free number for asking questions is 1-800-110-430. So we begin this lecture today, this discussion, and romantic trend is something that is to be thought over. For instance, I would like to ask you, Dr. Payal Nagpal, regarding what exactly is the romantic trend, and how is it placed, in the discussions about literature to begin with, and then other issues can be emerged. So please explain for our benefit as to what you understand by the word romantic.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. To respond to this question about what we understand by the term romantic, and particularly in terms of a romantic trend, I think we need to understand the late 18th and early 19th century in terms of new forms of thought, new changes in the society that are taking place, and in that sense, a kind of cross current that is happening between the social context and literary forms that are gradually changing. I think this idea of the romantic trend becomes extremely important, because we look at it especially in the context of, for instance, the English poets, the romantic poets, and their expression of it.
And you use the word developing in society. In the 18th century, certain things develop which are new, which means they are different from the 17th century trends.
Yes.
And is there something behind these trends that all the time works and that compels us to evolve something new?
Yes. If we were to just kind of sum it up in one word, this idea of emotion, this idea of the sentiment that emerges at the end of the 18th century becomes extremely important in the 19th century and takes on new forms and a new understanding, let's say, of the word imagination, for instance. So these changes take place, but even to reach there, this whole idea of the emergence of the sentiment or a certain kind of emotion in the context of let's say a writer's imagination of the society, of the world around him or her. So that is extremely poignantly felt towards the end of the 18th century. But to arrive at that, as you rightly pointed out, there is a lot that happens in the 18th century, and the way in which man, as in the human, becomes the focus of attention. the ordinary man becomes a focus of attention. I think that is something that can be credited in a sense to the 18th century, also referred to as the new classical age or the age of enlightenment. So this idea of enlightenment, of a kind of rational thinking that emerges and gradually kind of, also develops and evolves into, a kind of emotion that is there at the end of the 18th century is important.
It is said that in Renaissance, the human being came to the center of, social attention or ideological attention. But you used a new word in the 18th century context. That what is the common man?
Yes.
So in the Renaissance, there was the man. There was the man as opposed to the faith-centered kind of ideology, God, let us say. But in the 18th century, you say that the common man emerges as an active agent. So things will be looked at from the common man's angle.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes. And so because we are talking about, a context where there is the sense of reason and rationality. So in this kind of a context where the society is also undergoing a lot of changes, for instance, the merchant class gradually becoming more powerful, it becomes important to look at this particular age from the perspective of the emergence, in a sense, of this idea of the common man.
Which means in the 18th century, people, most of the important characters in drama and poetry were kings, queens, princes, duchess, duke, all these people.
Yes.
But in the 18th century, it is the common people.
It is the common.
Those people have gone into the background.
Yes. And a very sharp critique actually that emerges of this kind of money making and the upper rungs of the society, that is also there, which is why the satire or the mock heroic, these are forms that become extremely popular in the early 18th century, particularly early to mid 18th century.
Which means that people, then start using their minds to understand and change the reality, which was not the case earlier.
Which was not the case earlier, because earlier, if you actually look at it, for instance, if we look at Spenser's Faerie Queene or we look at Sidney's Arcadia, so this idea is that works were written and they were generally dedicated in a sense to, an extremely, not simply an important personage, but it would be the queen or, the powers that be. But here, when we gradually move into the 18th century, the early 18th century, so the system of patronage continues, but there are other things that are happening.
Like the traders, as you say.
Yes.
The traders and merchants,
Yes.
they are a new class. And that expresses itself, asserts itself in the 18th century more than any time else.
So, patronage is sought, but at the same time, the writer is very, very conscious of the sense of a public. That becomes very, very important, and Humphreys draws attention to this when he says that, this is a period of transition in a sense, towards this idea of the formation of the public. So the writer is, on the one hand, seeking patronage, and of course is writing epistles dedicated to the patron, and at the same time, the writer is also addressing the public. Now, this idea of addressing people at large is something that was in a sense missing in the 17th century, because it was a different world that we were looking at. But in the 18th century, there is a marked shift that happens.
You mean there is a stress on religion, there is a stress on the court, there is stress on manners, there is a stress on authority, privilege, patrons earlier. But now the stress is on money.
The stress is on money. Gradually, this is a class that has become important, so which is why, in fact, if I just look at some of these important features of the 18th century. So, for instance, I mean, the Grub Street phenomena, we have, what was called the Copyright Act of 1710, according to which a lot of the authors, in a sense, got certain kind of rights over their work. And this led to a totally new understanding of the role of the writer and the writer's relationship with what is called the public. This emergence of the public is very, very central to the early 18th century. So, in fact, I just quote, Samuel Johnson from his dictionary when he talks about the Grub Street phenomena. He says, it was originally the name of a street, much inhabited by writers of small histories, dictionaries and temporary poems, whence any mean production is called Grub Street. So, what this draws attention to is this kind of, idea of writing. One, of course, as I said, the system of patronage continues, but also writing as having some kind of commercial viability. This becomes a very important idea in the 18th century, and this is also the time period when the merchant class becomes extremely powerful, and so of course is going to enjoy a lot of position in the society. So if one were to look at certain generic features in a sense of the kind of writing that takes place in the 18th century, so I'd like to quote A.I. Humphreys here, who says that in the best Augustan work, social fact is being not only described but felt with a particular reality. Social behavior is both recorded and corrected in the interests of good sense. Now, these are two very important ideas. One, we have this idea of social fact that is being used in the context of the 18th century, and the idea of social reality. And what Humphrey says is social behavior is both recorded and corrected in the interests of good sense. So this tells us, this gives us a clue to the very, very important change that takes place in the 18th century, where earlier the society was extremely neatly stratified, and you had the order of the court and the kings and the queens and so on. So, but here we are now talking about social behavior, and this is not simply a kind of behavior that is exhibited in court, but it's the behavior and mannerisms of people at large. So this is something that is central, in fact, to a lot of writing that takes place in the 18th century. And so we have, and this is a very, very rich period, because we have different forms of writing that are prevalent in the 18th century. We have the form of the essay, we have poetry, and of course we have the emergence of the novel as a genre in this particular period. So and if we look at it socially, we are also looking at this as a time period where in the first couple of decades of the 18th century, because we are talking about society that is primarily pre-industrial, the industrial revolution is only going to take place later. So agriculture continues to be very, very important, and there is the idea of the countryside, and then there is the town. The city as such, as we understand it in the 19th century, is not there. So, and in this context, what emerges is, in the first half of the 18th century, is the idea of the gentleman. And before we actually look at that, I'd just like to draw attention to a very, very important thinker, absolutely at the beginning, end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century, who's Newton. And Newton, the reason I mention Newton here is because the kind of language that Newton uses is that it provides us a kind of indication into the way writers were going to soon experiment in terms of literature. So, for instance, in Optics in 1704, the text that emerged in 1704, Newton writes, "A naturalist would scarce expect to see the science of those become mathematical. And yet I dare affirm that there is as much certainty in it as part of optics." And then what he mentions is that is neither hypotheses nor inferring, but evinced by the mediation of experiments, concluding directly and without any suspicion of doubt. So this idea of observation, the idea of experimentation is something that begins of course at the beginning of the 18th century and bears fruit towards the end of the 18th, which is why the Industrial Revolution in a sense is possible in the 19th century. So this kind of language, and if we look at what Locke says in An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, if we look at the similarity in terms of the kind of language that is being used, he says when he talks about the factor of the mind, he says that I mean that simple appearance which the mind has in its view or perceives in itself when the idea is said to be in it. So this idea, and he calls this the determinate idea. So this idea of the mind as perceiving, the mind as observing. So this idea of observation becomes extremely important, which leads to a whole lot of literature where even when we talk about the idea of the gentleman here, looking at the world around you is something that the writer is doing, and is in a very, very different context from the kind of observation, for instance, that we will talk about in the 19th century in the context of, let's say, realism. Because in the 18th century, the writer is still, in a sense, bound by this whole system of patronage. But these are changes that are setting in gradually. So, whether we talk about philosophy, we talk about Locke, or we talk about changes in the field of science, and we talk about Newton. So there is something that is happening fundamentally different to the language, which is more rational and reason based.
You have in fact used these very significant words in the context of the 18th century, and the word is reason. Now, before reason, reason is something that liberates humanity from authority and patronage. So you can, with reason, you can understand even the role of the king. You can understand the role of the patron. So socially speaking, the patron is above other people. But when you enter the realm of reason, when you enter the realm of the mind, then of course all of us become equal. So a kind of equality. There's a way that is paved towards equality in the 18th century. And before equality, all human beings are one, are the same. So this is definitely a new revolutionary idea at that time, which puts all people on the same page.
Same page.
Yes.
Right. And this is where I think the whole idea of the writing of the essays becomes very, very significant. For instance, Addison and Steele, Steele starts the Tatler and under the pseudonym of Isaac Bickerstaff. And then, of course, we have the Spectator, and we have famous characters like Sir Roger de Coverley, and we have the idea of the gentleman, and we have Sir Andrew Freeport. So,
and these people are picked up from the common life.
And these people are picked up from the common life.
And they start representing all people in England at that time.
Yes.
And they are visualized as characters. And they are characters as different from characters in the plays, because they are there in the novel.
Yeah.
And the language of the novel is the language of the street, which is not the case with literature earlier. So 18th century that way is distinct from the 17th century.
Totally distinct. In fact, if we look at the gentleman, so he's in the Tatler, Steele writes that I shall begin with him. We usually call a gentleman or man of conversation, and then goes on to define what are the attributes and what one actually looks for in the gentleman. So does he that never shocks you, though he's seldom entertaining, is more likely to keep your favor than he who often entertains and sometimes displeases you, and so on. So it goes like this. But what is important here is the engagement of the writer, who is trying to evolve the idea of these different people who are there in the society, and almost kind of through the form of the essay in the Tatler or in the Spectator, contributing and creating almost like a catalogue of mannerisms, a catalogue of characters who are to behave in a certain kind of manner. And so, for instance, he says in another particular issue, he says that the first of our society is a gentleman of Worcestershire of ancient descent, a baronet, and his name is Sir Roger de Coverley. And of course then goes on into that. But the important character here is Sir Andrew Freeport. He says the person of next consideration, and so where Sir Roger de Coverley is, is somebody who belongs, in a sense, he's to the upper category. But we have the new man here, who is Sir Andrew Freeport, a merchant of great eminence in the city of London, a person of great industry, strong reason, great experience. His notions of trade are noble and generous. So this is the new person, and with this comes in a whole lot of new writing that gives space to this new person. And so when we talk about Addison and Steele, of course we have to mention the Tatler and the Spectator. And but along with this, of course, towards the mid 18th century, we have the emergence of the novel as a genre where these characters are then going to find not only a lot of space, but in a sense their lives are going to be played out in the novel as a genre. But this whole idea, in a sense, the culture itself in England is undergoing a major change, because we have the whole idea of the coffee houses and the clubs and characters like Sir Andrew Freeport being discussed, and this is a very major contribution, I think, that is made in the 18th century.
So more and more people are being involved now in the literary activity.
Yes.
And the human being is being imagined as a perceiver, as a person who experiments. You use these words from
Yes.
Newton. It's starting of science also. It's starting of rationality, which means that every human being has imagination, every human being has reason, and with reason one perceives, one also experiments, then one tests with experiment whatever is there around oneself, and then infers. So this is a new kind of a method of learning,
Yes.
which is there in the 18th century. It was not there earlier in this form.
And with this, what is happening is that writers are not only experimenting at the level of these ideas through observation or recording, let's say, the mannerisms of people, but also experimenting with genres and coming up with new categories in a sense of writing. For instance,
This is interesting. So how are they experimenting with genre?
so for instance, we have a totally different idea that emerges with the essays that are written by Addison and Steele, and the kind of culture, which is a culture that discusses in a sense the class that is going to be very powerful in the 19th century, which is the middle class. So that characters from around them are being discussed.
So essays become important.
The essay becomes
it's a
very
new
important.
genre.
In the first half of the 18th century particularly, of course, poetry is, reigns in a sense through the 18th century, but the essay also becomes very important.
Essay means a statement.
Yes.
Essay means an observation of a common nature, and from there, one to which one can relate, and later on one can expand the idea through the essay.
Yes.
This form is not there in the 17th century.
This form is
in the
not
16th
there.
century.
Yes, and this kind of free-flowing prose, this kind of free-flowing expression of ideas, which is not there earlier. So that happens in the 18th century.
Which means a genre in which idea actually regulates, idea influences, and idea extends the scope of thought, which was not the case earlier.
Which is not the case.
Earlier there was meter, there was versification, but there was no simple, as you say, free-flowing prose.
Yeah.
That takes one in one direction, which the life is taking at that time.
Yes, and things could not in that sense be stated explicitly the way writers take issues and ideas on in the 18th century. That was certainly missing in a sense in the earlier time period. So we find an expression of these very ideas also in poetry. For instance, if we look at poetry by Alexander Pope. So for instance, in what is called an essay on man, a fragment of work that is dedicated to Henry St. John, Lord Bolingbroke, and from the epistle, I'll just read out from the second epistle, which is of the nature and state of man with respect to himself as an individual. And Pope writes, "Know then thyself, presume not caught to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. Placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great, with too much knowledge for the skeptic side, with too much weakness for the stoic's pride. He hangs between. So in doubt to act, and so it goes on."
Even though it's verse, it looks like prose.
Yes.
And in fact, it's strange that in the 18th century, even the titles of poems are essays.
Yes.
Essay on man.
An essay on man.
Yes, criticism. These are new titles.
Yes.
One could not think of such titles. In the 19th century, poets will think twice before this.
Yeah.
But in the 18th century, they're just using the word essay for the title of a poem.
For the title of the poem. And it's interesting, I think Pope, who's known for his style of writing and brevity, so the proper study of mankind is man.
Yes.
I think this is the crux in a sense of the 18th century, that man, the proper study of mankind is man. That
And,
do not
and
look,
see, what is the word study doing here?
yes.
Study means analysis. Study means observing very closely and commenting on things.
Yes.
So if you are studying life in poetry, then it's a different kind of poetry.
Yes.
So that poetry belongs to the 18th century.
So and the fact that man is to be the object of analysis, and do not, in a sense, the interesting part is that maybe a kind of this idea of God or a different world that remains there, but what is being kind of subject to analysis is man, and a lot of writing then in a sense goes into that. So he writes that created half to rise and half to fall, great Lord of all things, yet a prey to all. So sole judge of truth, in endless error hurled, the glory, jest and riddle of the world. And another stanza that one must look at is, go wondrous creature, mount where science guides, go measure earth, weigh air and state the tides, instruct the planets in what orbs to run, correct old time and regulate the sun. So I think the fact that man has a role to play in all these things, has a role to conduct these experiments to find out the truth, and the fact that there is something about the universe that can be known through experiment is something that has already been initiated, Newton onwards.
Universe, Earth, the Sun, all these are subjects of discussion
Yes.
now, and in poetry,
In
of
poetry.
all things.
In poetry.
Yes, and you used the word culture earlier regarding the 18th century and manners. So what is culture? Culture is manners, I believe?
Culture is manners, and 18th century, of course, is to be credited with the development of a new kind of humanism that
Yes.
is, in a sense, based on the analysis of man as such. When Pope says that the proper study of mankind is man, it leads also to the development of this idea of a concept that evolves different kind of humanism.
And culture and manners, when I think of culture and manners, I think of how a man walks, how a man talks, how a man moves around,
Yes.
how one befriends others,
Yes.
how one disagrees with others.
So a kind of objective description, in a
Yes.
sense, dispassionate and detached sort of a
What
description.
was the coffee house in the 18th century?
So the coffeehouse culture, when we look at
Yes.
these essays, for instance, so who are these characters and what are they supposed to do? So
Yes.
this idea of morals becomes very, very important. So I think, when A.R. Humphreys had written this idea that, social behavior is both recorded and corrected in the interests of good sense. I think this idea of correction particularly is something that takes the minds of writers like Addison and Steele, or even Pope, this idea of improvement, the fact that there is the potential and scope of improvement, and of course, more importantly, this idea that there is a kind of moral upliftment that should happen, and that individuals are capable of it. So I think these two ideas go hand in hand, and the coffee house culture particularly is to be credited with this.
Coffee houses, you mean were replacing the pubs of the earlier period?
Yes.
People would get together
The
there in the
taverns,
evening?
the barns and taverns
Yes, yes.
of the earlier period were being
replaced
replaced
by
by
the
the
coffee house.
coffee house. And so also the coffee house culture would then give the opportunity to people to actually sit together and discuss these ideas. And so something is written, an
In
essay
pubs
is
you could
written.
not discuss ideas.
Yes.
In the coffee houses you can.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
So things are written, and let's say an essay that is published in the Spectator could be the topic of discussion. So how is it that people should behave, since we talked about that. So these are ideas that are being discussed in
What is the
great detail.
connection of coffee houses, people, culture with the city? You mean people are now coming more to the cities?
So it's more like town in that sense,
Yes.
and city in its proper form is only going to come towards the end of the 18th century, and so it's still in a sense in the making, and of course with the whole idea of the enclosures and the enclosure system, due to which a lot of people who had these small patches of land, they had to give up their land and move elsewhere for employment, and they started moving towards what was then called the city, where gradually some kind of what should one say, a kind of earlier form of what one could call the industry was being set up. So in its nascent form was being set up. So in fact this idea is actually what I also now wanted to move on to.
Yes,
so
yes,
for
please.
instance, when we look at how the tone changes, when we look at poetry in this transition in a sense from let's say Johnson's London, which is subtitled a poem in imitation of the third satire of Juvenal, and is written somewhere around 1738. So and how there is this critique in a sense of the ways of the people and what it's doing to London. That is very, very important, and how this is gradually going to give way to a new kind of emotion that emerges almost like 1750s onwards. So very difficult to kind of tie it down to any date, but this idea is gradually emerging. So for instance, just read out a few lines from Johnson's poem London, and he says, to such a groaning nations, in talking about Britain, to such a groaning nations spoils are given when public crimes inflame the wrath of heaven. But what, my friend, what hope remains for me, who start at theft and blush at perjury, who scarce forbear, though Britain's court, he's saying, to pluck a titled poet's borrowed wing, a statesman logic unconvinced can hear. And so he says, and finally, in the last stanza, he says, much could I add, but see the boat at hand, the tide retiring calls me from the land. Farewell. When youth and health and fortune spent, thou fliest for refuge to the wilds of Kent, and tired like me with follies and with crimes, in angry numbers was in succeeding times. Then shall my friend, nor thou, refuse his aid, still foe to vice forsake his Cambrian shade. In virtue's cause once more, exert his rage, thy satire point and animate thy page. So Johnson is, there is a kind of objectivity to Johnson's language, and a kind of rationality that continues and is very, very critical of what is happening at that time, in this poem, London. And when we move on from here to something that's written towards the middle of the 18th century, and we have Thomson's Seasons, how the western sun withdraws the shortened day. Now this sentence itself, in a sense, signals the beginning of a new kind of writing, which one sees developing, for instance, in Gray or in Goldsmith. So and what happens here is that as they're trying to understand the world around them, the world is now changing. Post the middle of the 18th century, the world in England begins to change. So this idea of the city that emerges towards the end, it starts taking its nascent form. And so with people leaving their villages and town areas and moving to what is called the city, starts happening. And
which might also lead towards some kind of sadness, some kind of stagnation.
Yes, which leads to a kind of sadness that emerges. And for instance, Gray has written The Elegy in a Country Churchyard, and this is around 1751. Or Goldsmith writes The Deserted Village in around 1770.
Which means cities are expanding at the cost of the village, which is now deserted.
Because the villages are now deserted.
Yes.
So
there is a kind of vacuum.
Yes.
Somewhere else.
In fact, it begins with these beautiful lines. The elegy begins with these beautiful lines. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly over the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me.
This is, this is very strange in the sense, that in the early 18th century, as you pointed out, there is that emphasis on reason.
Yes.
But in the mid 18th century, people realized that with that logic of equality among human beings, let's have also equality with the villages, and that is missing.
Yes.
In fact, villages is losing it for the benefit of the cities.
Villages totally losing the benefit of the city, and which is why, if you look at the titles of these poems, so we have Goldsmith writes what is called The Deserted Village. George Crabbe writes a poem called The Village, and which means that the village is now a topic that needs to be discussed.
Which means if equality and this freedom or criticism of patronage, if they had not come in the early 18th century, nobody would have thought about the existence of the village.
Yes.
And now village also comes into focus, and some kind of a rift, occurs between the city and the village.
Yes.
So now people look towards that, and then they see the loss.
And that becomes the moment of shift, the moment of transition, where this idea of a new kind of emotion starts emerging. So in contrast to the clear, rationality, objectivity, where satires are, the mock epic form, or the satire becomes very, very important, suddenly there is a kind of mellowing that happens, a kind of melancholic mood, nostalgia for the village, that starts emerging.
From rationality to simplicity. The village is simple, rational is higher, and city.
Yes. Again, Goldsmith's lines, sweet Auburn, loveliest village of the plain, where health and plenty cheered the labouring swain. So how often have I paused on every charm, and goes on to describe the village, and laments this kind of the emptying out, in a sense, of the village, which is why the title of his poem is The Deserted Village, because he says, no more thy glassy brook reflects the day, but choked with sedges works its weedy way. So there are weeds now, and the glassy brook that reflected the day is no longer there.
The rural landscape is changing, and the city also is now burgeoning, and there are changes that are not exactly welcome after the initial burst of energy of the rationality. Now things are moving towards simplicity, and from there there will be new clouds, and these clouds have to be taken note of.
And the poets are critical of this. So, for instance, Crabbe writes that yet in other scenes, some people are poor, but in other scenes more fair in view, where plenty smiles. And Crabbe writes, alas, she smiles for few. And those who taste not, yet behold her store, are as the slaves that dig the golden ore. The wealth around them makes them doubly poor. So this idea of poverty acquires a totally different meaning at the end.
So if wealth is accumulated in certain corners, then that is accompanied by poverty elsewhere. So the gap between the poor and the rich now increases.
So we are talking about 1780s, and in a sense one has actually covered a lot of a major span of time, from the time period of writing, let's say, to please the Queen, to a system of patronage. One is now looking at poets who are who in a sense, take on this responsibility of responding to these changes that are there around them, and are very sharply critical. I mean, A Modest Proposal, of course, is another very important example. But in this context of this shift that takes place in the style of writing in poetry towards the end of the 18th century, I think Crabbe's The Village becomes a very important point.
Which means that the 18th century starts with the focus on the merchant, on the trader, on the person who is accumulating money, but that creates its own problems. And initially there was satire, that there was a kind of morality from which angle the life was being criticized. But now life is being criticized in the latter half of the 18th century from the point of view of the village. This is a new development in the 18th century itself.
Yes, and in fact, if we also look at another, movement that's parallel, for instance, we have, Pope's Rape of the Lock and the description of Belinda's entire toilet. So, and how that has been done in mock heroic terms. Now, this idea, which we are all well aware of, is picked up by Gray, when he writes Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat Drowned in a Tub of Goldfishes. So, the same idea, her conscious tale her joy declared, the fair round face, the snowy beard, the velvet of her paws, and finally it ends like this. So, no dolphin came, no nereid stirred, nor cruel Tom nor Susan heard. A favorite has no friend. And again, finally the last line being, nor all that glisters gold. So these ideas that Pope, of course, dealt with in great detail in Rape of the Lock. And one of the ideas was this, criticism of the kind of money that is spent on vanity. So this idea is again picked up by Gray. And if we move on to another very important person in this particular period, then that is William Hogarth, whose sketches were sharply critical of marriages, particularly, for instance, that were made on the basis of money. An idea, of course, that was taken on in the comic spirit towards the end of the 17th century with the Restoration comedy. But with Hogarth, for instance, he has a series of six sketches on marriage called Marriage et la Mode. And if we look at the titles of these sketches, so there is a marriage contract, there is After the Marriage, Scene with the Quack, Countess's Levee, The Death of the Earl, The Death of the Countess. So, Hogarth's sketches also employ satire, and warn people against this kind of corruption that has gradually seeped into the society. So when we talk about the different modes, I think here again, visual arts that has already been there is being used to understand the world around in a very different manner. So of course, in the 19th century then, taking on, let's say, from artists such as Hogarth, we will have artists in the 19th century who are going to depict the ordinary people.
So which means the seeds of the 19th century are sown in the 18th century, towards in the second half. So now money will be under critique, and even reason, rationality will be equated with fashions and manners, and people will be finally fed up even with this.
So which is where, for instance, we also have Thomas Gainsborough, who's Gainsborough, who's an 18th century artist, and the range is very interesting. He does what are called the conversation pieces. So where they show family and friends in conversation, and so he has he's done works like Mr. and Mrs. Robert Andrews, and at the same time there is another one which is called The Harvest Wagon, which totally depicts the countryside. So this idea of what is happening to the village, this idea of what is happening in a class that is gradually becoming very rich, and of course the remnants in a sense of the nobility and what is happening to them. These ideas are being also depicted in not only through literature but through the medium of visual arts. So Gainsborough, for instance, has a painting called Mary Countess Howe, and then there is another, The Cottage Girl with Dog and Pitcher. So which are totally different, and of course mid 18th century onwards,
it's not castles,
it's not castles,
it's a cottage,
it's a cottage,
yes, in a village, yes.
And of course we have the most important factor is the emergence of the novel, and in which the ordinary characters in a sense find complete representation, and they are in a sense the protagonists in the novel.
In fact, I was wondering, as you were talking about the 18th century in its two different phases. One phase, where there was an emphasis on reason, in the other phase where there was an emphasis on inequality, poverty on the other side, melancholy, the loss of the village, and that was a gain for the city. All this happened in the second half of the 18th century, and that is the century when people like Wordsworth are born.
Yes.
Wordsworth is born in 1770. Yes. So is Coleridge. And Blake is born in, I think, the 1760s. So if Blake is there, Blake will spend his 40 years in the 18th century. Wordsworth will be 30 years at 1800. So these people who will be romantic poets, they are getting their grounding, they're getting their discipline, they're getting their culture from the reality of the 18th century. And 18th century is this, combination of the market and money on one side and the loss of the village on the other.
On the other, absolutely. And this is where, it becomes this whole idea in the 18th century, in a sense, be it at the level of ideas. I mean, we discussed the idea of the emergence of a different kind of language, let's say with Newton and with Locke. But when we come towards the middle of the 18th century, that has changed in a very, very distinct sort of manner, because and the fact that the writers, the poets, be it the poets or the essays, they are all sharply cognizant of this change that is happening around them, of a class that is increasingly amassing money, and on the other hand there are people who are feeling doubly poor. Or for that matter, the fact that villages in a sense are now the deserted zones, and something else is happening and they're shifting to the city. So this is something that is extremely important and forms in a sense the basis to the understanding of what we call the romantic trend that emerges and gains shape in the 19th century.
In fact, I would like in this context to raise this issue of enlightenment. You use this term very, very rightly in the context of emergence of a new method, of a new vision in the 18th century called enlightenment, which means that reason is to be stressed, and other things have to be in the background. Now this enlightenment, I think, finally gets confined to the city, and the village is the sufferer. So maybe some people will react to the very essence and core of enlightenment and will say no reason, no that kind of a light, but then some kind of simplicity and depth which is there in the poor people, which is there in the birds, which is there in the realm of nature, in the lost values of the village. And they will in fact get away from enlightenment per se. What do you say on that?
I think what happens is that when we look at this, the emergence of this particular sentiment in the middle of the 18th century, which of course gradually gains kind of importance towards the end of the 18th century, and of course with the romantic poets and so on, it becomes a very, very important factor and develops into the idea of imagination as well. But what happens, what is significant is that it's not as if they lose sight of rationality. So I think the poets, the writers who are looking at these villages that are now, as Goldsmith calls it, the deserted village, it's not as if they are losing sight of their rationality. I would like to actually say that they used rationality in a sense to now evolve a new emotion, it's a new perspective of looking at things around them. And yes, of course, they are nostalgic about a lost way of life, or there is a melancholic sentiment that is there, but they are also recording a change that is happening. And I think that is where the sense of rationality and reason should be kind of brought back in. Because that's how that's how I would look at it, that yes, for them the more dominant emotion would probably not be that of the kind of reason that was there in the first part of the 18th century, but for them they're also recording something that's happening. It's an entire, it's like the topography changing.
No, the point that you are making is very relevant to the discussion, in the sense that rationality and open eyes and perception and observation, these things combine human beings into a group, and then that group starts pursuing its own interests, and that group keeps increasing. So rationality that way is in a way adding to the richness of culture in the 18th century. This is Enlightenment, where at the center is rationality. What happens later on is, and this is actually an outcome of the development of rationality, in the second half of the 18th century, this rationality becomes somewhat unspontaneous. I say unspontaneous because the word spontaneous is used and not rationality by people like Wordsworth. When in 1798, when he writes his preface to Lyrical Ballads, then his basic word is spontaneity. So something that is natural, something that is simple, that is innocence. All these words, a new vocabulary is being created now under the stress of Enlightenment, which was there, the soul of imagination, the soul of working of all the human mind in the early part of the 18th century. So these things converge, and a new movement straight away comes from the old one.
And today when we talk about the 18th century, we also look at it in terms of certain narratives that are written by slaves and so on. But here I would like to bring in Samuel Johnson, who writes A Brief to Free a Slave, that was written in favor of slave Joseph Knight for freedom from his Scottish master. But what he says about equality is extremely important, and I think one of the best manifestations, in a sense, of this idea of the spirit of rationality and reason. So he says that it is impossible not to conceive that men in their original state were equal, and very difficult to imagine how one would be subjected to another but by violent compulsion. An individual may indeed forfeit his liberty by a crime, but he cannot by that crime forfeit the liberty of his children. And he says very clearly that no man is by nature the property of another. The defendant, because he is also defending somebody, is therefore by nature free. And finally, of course, the case is also settled in favor of the slave. But the point that one is making here is that of course here is a new kind of writing that emerges alongside this, because we have slave narratives and so on, and we have the novel form. We also have the essays, and we have change that is taking place in the medium of visual arts, and all this is being done under this umbrella term of the Age of Enlightenment. So this idea of a certain kind of rationality that we are going to see towards the end of the 18th century, especially in the context of, let's say, the French Revolution and then what happens thereafter, I think this is also there, a certain kind of democratic spirit that is gradually emerging. So in a very, very extremely nascent sort of a manner, but is gradually emerging, and can be seen in the kind of writing that the 18th century writers are engaged with.
Of course, now we are nearing the end of our discussion, but one point that can be carried forward some other day would be the point of England at this point of time, and France and other European countries, emerging as potential colonizers of the world.
Yes.
And when that happens, the emphasis shifts from England to those places. So rationality, enlightenment, scientific spirit, all of them will make them progress, but that progress then will make them colonizers elsewhere.
Yes.
That is where romanticism has a role to play,
and which is where I mean that's the reason that I brought in this particular piece by Samuel Johnson called A Brief to Free a Slave, so which is written in favor of the slave, so that he could be, he could gain freedom. So, and of course, there are now narratives that are available, like the interesting narrative of the life of Oladoa Ikwan or Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself, which emerges again at the end of the 18th century. So here too something different is happening, and people are responding to these changes in a very different sort of manner. And when we compare it with what happened, I think, towards the end of the 17th century, I think the world has completely changed by the time we look at the late 18th century time period, and forms a very good basis in a sense of understanding the sweeping changes that take place in the early 19th century.
In 1 or 2 minutes, what do you think can be said about the 18th century as a background to Romanticism?
I think this idea that the language that becomes scientific and gradually changes and also acquires a kind of sentiment, and yet of course continues to gain some semblance or retain the semblance of rationality, is something that can be seen in the 18th century. And also this whole idea of experimenting with different generic mediums, especially the emergence of the novel, the writing of the essay, and a kind of change that sets in visual arts. I think these are some very, very important factors. So a kind of a thrust towards a kind of a spirit that is free and that is equal will gradually set in and lead to some changes towards the end of the 18th century that form the basis, in a sense, of what will take place in the 19th century.
Well, friends, we come to the end of the discussion today, and Dr. Faerie Nagpal raised the important questions of emergence of scientific thought, of rationality, of enlightenment in the early part of the 18th century, and then this neoclassical kind of stress on mock heroic and discussion about the patrons in society, and then the emphasis shifted. This was a popular idea. Mercantilism became a kind of doctrine which was governing in nature in the 18th century, and then because of the emphasis of money, trade, profit, and all those things, poverty also increased. The indifference to nature also increased, and that gave rise to a trend which would later on be called the Romantic trend. So we have this kind of significant discussion with respect to the emergence of the Romantic trend, and we'll take the discussion forward in the following lectures. Thank you.